Instead, what did they do? They all flew to Hawaii and took a bunch of pictures of each other on the Splendor, taking measurements and doing some kind of sound test or something on a boat that was 30 years old.
So thank you everybody for joining us. I am very delighted to have with me today Sam Perroni, the author of the book Brainstorm, an investigation into the mysterious death of Natalie Wood. This book was actually suggested in a comment on a previous video we had done on Natalie Wood. So I'm really glad that it was suggested. I just finished it. It's fascinating. If you're interested in the Natalie Wood case, you really need to read this book. It has some new information that you have not heard before. And I'm very excited to talk to Mr. Perroni about this more. And I think here, I'd like for you to kind of share a little bit for maybe people who have read the other Natalie Wood books and think that they've heard everything there is to know about the case. Tell us a little bit about what makes your book different.
Here's the biggest difference between my book and the other books that are out there. None of the other authors have any experience investigating a criminal case. That's the first thing. The second thing is none of the authors actually dug into the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department files like I have, the 1981 files in particular. Nobody's really seen them. I have crime scene photographs that people have never seen. I uncovered information in the file that the 2011 Sheriff's Department never even read.
Wow, that's incredible.
The difference between those books and my books is that I don't have any suppositions in my books. I don't have any theories or any, well, it could have been. I have actual factual information that I found, and in the back of the book are the references to all the sources that I used in finding that information. I tried to put in as many diagrams, documents, and things of that nature that I thought were most relevant. I couldn't put everything. There was too much. The book would have been 500 pages long. But put in as much as I could, the critical stuff. There was even a lead in there that took me to North Carolina. Nobody's been to North Carolina investigating this case, not even the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. No officers talked to the people that I talked to out there, and nobody discovered what I discovered in North Carolina. There's some important things that happened in North Carolina, particularly a fight between Natalie and Robert Wagner in Walken's presence in the restaurant of the hotel where they were staying. There's also factual information about Robert Wagner making more than one trip to North Carolina when Natalie was making the movie Brainstorm. That's what the North Carolina thing is about, for those of you who may not know the full story of Natalie's case. She was making a film that was called Brainstorm. So they were in North Carolina on vacation. Robert Wagner made more than one trip out there. In his books, he claimed he made one trip. And when he came back, he didn't believe the rumors that there was an affair going on between Walken and Natalie. And I think that is baloney. And I believe that I have the evidence in the book to show that it was. I think, based on the evidence that Robert Wagner believed there was something going on between Natalie and Walken, or that there was potentially something going on between Walken and Natalie. And I think that was part of his actions later on when they went to Catalina Island.
That is a really fascinating part of the book, reading about the research you did in North Carolina and how you followed that lead. And I think that there are so many examples in this book where you really get to see the investigative process. Like I was telling you earlier, I really felt like I was watching an episode of Matlock. It was a really, really interesting look into, how much effort was put into investigating these leads and things that you looked at that no one has ever talked about before. There's just so much new information in here.
So, Carrie, to answer your question, I traveled literally coast to coast. I traveled to the East Coast and I traveled to the West Coast multiple times. I chased witnesses down in Hawaii, in Oklahoma, North Carolina, New York, and a couple other places. I can't even remember now. But I tracked them down. Some of them, it took me years to find them. And I kept on until I found them. Some of the witnesses were deceased, and some of them wouldn't talk to me. But that's what I did, and that's what you have to do if you're going to investigate a case, if you're really going to investigate.
And this book really does investigate. It covers so many details that I've never heard talked about before. I also thought that your lawsuit against the LAPD was a very interesting story. Tell us a little bit about what prompted that lawsuit and what the outcome was.
Initially, what happened was I sued the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and the coroner for records relating to the 1981 autopsy and relating to the 1981 investigation. And they fought me tooth and nail. Even to the day, the folks in California don't want the truth to come out about Natalie Wood, even up to the day. So they fought me tooth and nail, and finally the judge, as he should have, ordered them to produce certain documents. I obtained over 300 pages of investigative materials, including crime scene photographs. Those photographs had never been seen by anyone except for the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and me. Suzanne Finstad did apparently look at a couple, 2 or 3 of them, but since she wasn't a criminal defense attorney or a criminal prosecutor, she really didn't know what she was looking at. A couple of the photographs have some very, very telling things in them. They not only were missed by her, they were missed by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. By the way, I want to say something right now at this point when you held up my book. Most unfortunately, the publisher of my book sent out hardback copies without my color photographs.
Oh.
So when this interview is over with, if you will give me your address, I will mail you a set of the color photographs.
Oh, that would be wonderful.
You'll be able to see what I was talking about in the book.
Oh, thank you so much.
The same way for any of your viewers, have hardback books that do not have color photographs in them. If they will go to my website, NatalieWoodBrainstorm.com. On there, they'll find an email address. It's NatalieWoodBrainstorm@gmail.com. If they will send me an email, I will send them free of charge a set of those color photographs that they should have gotten when they purchased the book.
Oh, wonderful. Yes, thank you.
If they buy a paperback, which they can do on my website, the paperbacks have the color photographs in them.
And you mentioned Suzanne Finstad, and so I think one thing that might be interesting for people who haven't read your book yet to know is that in Suzanne Finstad's book, she pretty much chalks up what happened with this case and why it didn't get pursued further to a general sense of incompetence with the police department, maybe Detective Rajor having been a little starstruck by Robert Wagner. But you are much more direct about what you think happened.
Well, With all due respect to Suzanne Finstad, she's wrong. Those investigators were not incompetent. They had ulterior motives for not thoroughly investigating Natalie Wood's case in 2011. And in 1981, the fix was in, plain and simple. Nobody was incompetent. Detective Rasher had been a detective for 30-some years. He was close to retirement at the time. He had seen every kind of murder case known to man. He knew exactly what to do. He just didn't do it. And I think he didn't do it because his boss, the sheriff, Peter Pitches, told him not to do it. I think he said, Dwayne, I want you to go out to Catalina Island, interview a few folks, and shut this investigation down. And that's what Rasher did.
Well, you make a very, very compelling case for the interconnectedness, the relationships between the sheriff, Robert Wagner. I was fascinated to see, for example, that picture of a young Robert Wagner with the acting sheriff at the time of Natalie's death. That's just information that I think a lot of people don't know.
Yes. Oh no, they were all connected. And
so interesting.
The connection was really fortified because Peter Pitches was basically fallen over, intoxicated with Frank Sinatra. He couldn't get enough of old Frank. I found sworn testimony where he says under oath that they were big time buddies. Frank Sinatra, Robert Wagner, Natalie Wood were friends. Frank Sinatra didn't want this case going any further than where it was. Natalie fell off the boat and drowned. Period.
The story of the friendship between the sheriff and Frank Sinatra was fascinating to me. I had no idea. But you really paint a picture of how, even in 1981, I think those vestiges of old Hollywood were still, alive and well when this was happening.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they were big time. So was the influence of the mob on Hollywood. It was still roaring and going back in the 70s and early 80s. All those folks were tied together. And this is not supposition on my part. I'm not fantasizing about this. I have hard proof, and it's in the book.
Very much so. And like I was telling you before we started with the interview, one of the things about the book that I thought was really fascinating and really struck me was that story about trying to access the letter that Frank Sinatra had written to the board and the time that you had with that. Even from the grave, years after his death, he still seemed to have some pull there.
That's why I keep saying that even up to today, they are trying to keep what happened under wraps, even up to today. I'll just tip your viewers off a little bit here about what's in the book, but to make a long story short, Frank Sinatra wrote a letter to the Board of Commissioners where he basically said that Dr. Noguchi needs to be seen and not heard after his press conference on Natalie's case. Well, that letter ended up on the wall of one of the commissioners and hung there for 25 years until shortly before I decided I wanted it as a public record under the Public Records Act of California. And then it disappeared.
It's crazy.
Isn't that amazing?
That blew my mind.
So you can read all the details about that. You see, that letter proves that Frank Sinatra was involved in Natalie's case from the get-go, from the very beginning. I mean, I don't know how many letters Frank Sinatra wrote to people, but I bet not very many. And I think that's why that commissioner hung it on his wall. He and others made sure that it got shut down.
Yeah, and I was also struck, you have a quote from Robert Wagner from one of his memoirs, I think it was Pieces of My Heart, where he's reminiscing about the old days of Hollywood and how they had fixers. So if you got in some legal problems, somebody would make this go away. He really seems to romanticize that when he's talking about it in the book.
Yep, there's a lot of things that Robert Wagner admitted in those books. Nobody's, including the sheriff's department, nobody's ever read it. But, if there was a court trial, those books would be admissible as evidence. Those are admissions of Robert Wagner. All of his statements could be used against him in a trial. And yes, I think that it wasn't Pieces of My Heart. It was his book where he was reminiscing about old Hollywood.
You must remember this.
So you must remember this. That's right. Yeah. And in there, he talks about the fixers. And Harry Brand, the person that he said in there had fixed some things for him, Harry Brand was still affiliated with the studio at the time of Natalie's death. Robert Wagner had Frank Sinatra, Sydney Korshak, Harry Brand. He had so many people out there trying to protect him. It wasn't funny. And some of them are still alive today, and they're still trying to protect him.
It's really, really fascinating. And Sydney Korshak, tell us a little bit more about him. I was not aware of this until I read the book, but this was definitely a very interesting aspect of things.
Yes, Sydney Korshak at one time was probably one of the most powerful men in the state of California, not only Hollywood, because Sydney Korshak was the lawyer for the mob and out of Chicago. And the Chicago mob was deeply involved in the entertainment business. That's how a lot of them got started in the entertainment business, was hooking up with people like Frank Sinatra. They saw a lot of money out there in it, and they got involved in it. And they needed a lawyer. And Sydney Korshak was really smart about it. You never saw any of those mobsters with Sydney Korshak. He never got his picture made with them. He never hung out with them smoking cigars or drinking in a bar. He just sat up in his office and just, like the little puppet, he just dangled strings around and he took care of people and he took care of things. I'll tell you, this is like undisputed. Lana Wood's role in the James Bond movie was not the role she was supposed to have. She was supposed to be Tiffany something in Diamonds Are Forever, but Jill St. John wanted that role. Well, Jill St. John was Sydney Korshak's girlfriend. And so Sydney Korshak just went over and made sure that Jill St. John got that role. And Lana Wood got relegated to the lesser role.
Plenty O'Toole.
There you go.
Yeah, that connection with Jill St. John and Korshak, I had no idea. There were a lot of interesting things about Jill St. John in this book that I learned.
Oh, yeah. She was his girlfriend for about 10 years. He even bought her a home in Colorado, in one of the ski resorts there. When she went on her, quote, sabbatical, I think it was for about 10 years, during that period of time, on and off, I think.
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff I didn't know about her, and including, and I don't know how I missed this when I read Pieces of My Heart, but Robert Wagner spells out that speculations about Jill St. John were a problem in his marriage to Marion Marshall.
Yes, in my opinion, it wasn't speculation, and that's, my opinion, is based on the circumstantial evidence.
Yes. Well, it's spelled out there in his book, and then
all you gotta do is follow the timeline.
When it comes to Jill St. John and Robert Wagner, I think that you did a really good job of putting the timeline together there and showing people where some of the inconsistencies in their stories are.
You know, that's something else that nobody did. Nobody established a timeline.
No, I've never.
I'll give Suzanne Finstad credit for this, and I give her credit for it in my book. she was the first one to put together a short timeline of what happened Saturday night to show that there was a gap in time of about 2 hours between the time that Natalie, quote, disappeared and the time that Robert Wagner first made contact with the authorities. So I give her credit for that. But the sheriff's department didn't do a timeline. Nobody's done a timeline except me. That's the most important thing you do when you're investigating something is do a timeline.
I was very interested to see their credit card statements and some of the purchases that Robert Wagner had made, both before and after Natalie's death. Some very, very revelatory things there. Very, very interesting information. Yeah,
that's something else. I got that information out of her estate file. The police, the sheriff's department had never seen the file. They still haven't seen the file.
Yeah.
The file has all the information in it about how much Natalie was worth.
Which was mind-blowing to actually see it. Right. I had no idea.
I mean, it's motive evidence. And that's another thing that they didn't do. They didn't try to find no motive evidence. So Suzanne Finstead, I guess, would say that's incompetence. I say it's on purpose because I say they know that the first thing you do is to try to find motive evidence. That's the very first thing. If you've got a suspect, the very first thing you do is look for a motive. How much she was worth and how much Robert Wagner ended up with.
Yes.
A lot of money.
And his financial past and how much he benefited from this marriage to her was also...
And from that Charlie's Angels interest of Natalie's alone, he has obtained millions of dollars over the years.
One thing I was curious about, I had mentioned this in a previous video I did about Natalie's death, is when I read Suzanne Finstead's book, one of the things that really struck me was her recounting from a phone call that Lana Wood had told her about that Dennis DeVerne said he had actually seen Natalie in the water, which then was later recanted. And you bring this up in your book, that you got multiple stories when you were trying to investigate it. With everything that you looked at, what do you think? Do you think he actually did see this? Do you think he'll ever tell us?
Right. Well, you know what? It wasn't really recanted. Lana Wood said she never said it. She didn't recant. She just said, I never said that. I never told her that. He said it's false. I have that in writing.
Yeah.
It was a sensational way to end her book.
It certainly was that.
Well, I have to say.
But yeah, another thing that I was very interested in was reading your take on the reopening in 2011. You really are very critical that this was something that was ever done in earnest and feel that there were other reasons why this case was reopened and that there was never really a serious intent of pursuing it, which was very interesting for me to hear about.
That's right. There was something very, very serious going on in the sheriff's department. And they needed a media distraction. I'm convinced of that, based again on the events that occurred and the timing of everything, and what happened thereafter. That's why I disagree with anyone who says that these people were incompetent. I just think they had ulterior motives. I don't think they ever really intended to investigate Natalie's case like it should have been investigated.
Which I think to those of us who were watching this at home, Detectives Hernandez and Karina, I liked them. I thought they seemed very sincere. I thought they were really doggedly pursuing this. So I was a little disappointing to read some of the information in your book.
Yes, I know. I made a lot of people unhappy by writing some of the things that I wrote about. But you know, that was part of the truth. They were piddling around, acting like they were investigating a case that had been closed by their chief of detectives within 6 weeks of the quote reopening, making statements about persons of interest and things like that were just silly, in my opinion. This is no offense to them personally. Right?
Sure, of course.
As a matter of fact, I liked Detective Hernandez. But Detective Hernandez had bosses. And those bosses were guiding and directing his investigation. It's probably one of the reasons why you never went to North Carolina. Instead, what did they do? They all flew to Hawaii and took a bunch of pictures of each other on the Splendor, taking measurements and doing some kind of sound tests or something.
Yeah.
On a boat that was 30 years old. I mean, in a cove in Hawaii, not at Catalina. I mean, if you're going to do things like that, you've got to recreate it as it was at the time. It's got to be a cold, rainy day. It has to be on the water that is choppy like it is in the isthmus because the wind blows through there all the time. There's just a whole lot of things that you have to do in order to make sure your, quote, sound test is reliable. And flying to Hawaii and taking some sound tests over in a cove in Hawaii after the boat had been redesigned on the interior, by the way, it's nothing. I mean, in a court of the law, it would be, the judge would never let it in, ever. They didn't all need to fly to Hawaii twice. But they couldn't make a trip to North Carolina. It is what it is. Like I said, I'm not here just to be critical of everybody. I mean, I would have liked to have worked with Hernandez and helped him investigate the case. I really would have. I would have done it for free. But I could tell from the get-go that they were not interested in discovering the truth. You know what Karina told me under oath? Karina told me he had not read the 1981 file.
Wow.
Here was a man who was leading a reopening investigation of Natalie Wood's case, and he hadn't even read the 81 file. And I had that under oath in a deposition. Hernandez had never seen a report that had been prepared by the coroner's office first responder. He had never seen it until I handed it to him during the deposition.
Wow.
It's not somebody that's trying to get to the bottom of the case, I can tell you. He was shocked to see it. He said he'd never seen it before.
Wow. I was also very surprised to read the Death in Dark Water, the 48-hour special from 2018. I watched that at home. I was really riveted by it. And reading your backstory on how that came to be and your analysis of that program was fascinating to me. I don't think anybody knows that.
There were things that were said in that, Carrie, that are just so far off the mark, it's not even funny. But I listened to it about 2 or 3 times, and there was an interview with Mark Crowley where he said something that was absolutely critical to the case. He said that he didn't go to Catalina Island that weekend because Wagner and Walken were fighting all the time. Now, what does that mean? That means that there was serious tension between Wagner and Walken before they ever even got on that boat. Nobody's written about that. Nobody's told a story about that. And Christopher Walken has never talked about that. But that is what a man who was there at the time and who was asked to go to Catalina Island that weekend said about why he didn't go.
So revelatory.
They were fighting all the time, which corroborates what I'm telling you that I found in North Carolina. There was a fight out there in a restaurant. It was so serious that people reported that they had to actually hang on to somebody. I don't know if it was Wagner or if it was Walken or who it was. That was never in anybody's file, even though there was a lead in there that told them where to find it.
Yeah, fascinating.
That wasn't incompetence, Gary. That was intentional.
Yeah. Well, you convinced me. I was also. Yeah.
Well, let me tell you something. And I've said this before, and I'll say it for you. If I had the evidence that existed in 2011, and I was the prosecutor, I believe I could convict Robert Wagner of murder. If I was the prosecutor and I had the evidence that existed in 2011. And the reason why I say 2011 is many of the witnesses have died, or they have gotten so old that they're not capable witnesses any longer. You can't say the same is true for 2023.
On that note, working against time in this sense, or, you know, with so many witnesses having passed away and just evidence that's lost to time,
Yes.
in your opinion, do you think that there's any way that Robert Wagner will ever be prosecuted for the death of Natalie Wood?
No. And I've heard reports that he's not well, and I regret that for his family. But Robert Wagner would never be prosecuted for the murder of Natalie Wood, no matter how much evidence was dug up, because key witnesses have passed away. Key witnesses can no longer remember the details and the facts. There have been documents and other things that have been lost to the passage of time. A prosecutor just could not prosecute this case with the evidence that still exists that would be admissible in court.
Do you think Dennis DeVerne will ever tell us everything he knows? Do you feel like he's still holding out?
No, he's holding out. He knows more. And I'll tell you why he's never going to tell us the truth, the full truth. I mean, I do believe some of the critical things that he says, like, for instance, that there was a fight between Robert Wagner and Natalie below before Natalie turned up missing. I do believe that. But I don't believe it so much because Dennis DeVerne says it. I believe it so much because of the evidence that I found that corroborates what he said, as well as Robert Wagner's admissions in his book. It all ties together. But I do believe Dennis DeVerne has more to tell if he told the truth. And the reason why I believe it is because I think that through all these years, Dennis DeVerne has been worried about being an accomplice to a murder. And he has been afraid that somebody might try to prosecute him, or that he might have to actually confess that he stood by while his boss did away with Natalie. That may be the biggest reason why he'll never say anything.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and it's just been a pleasure to talk to you. I really loved this book. I really encourage anybody who's interested in the Natalie Wood case, even if you think you've read everything there is to read about this and there's no new information, I promise you there will be things in this book that blow your mind. It's a fascinating read, and I thank you so much, Sam, for joining us today and talking with us about it. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for giving us your time.
Thank you, Carrie. I've had a very enjoyable evening, and I just appreciate your interest in me and the things you said about my book.
Absolutely. Thank you.